Today, we're gonna make some money. So a few days ago, I got a call from a guy that wants a sign for his family farm. Originally, it was gonna be a 12 by 48 sign, which I was gonna charge $400. Then he called back and he said he wanted it 18 by 48. So that's 6 square feet. At $100 a square foot, I was gonna charge him $600. I decided to give him a break and charge him $550, and he talked me down to $5. But that's all right. It's still a great payday for a short day of work. So the total material cost in this is probably under $40. We had two 8-foot redwood 2x6s, which were 15 bucks a piece, and we figure around 10 bucks for miscellaneous, the primer, the clear, and all the different stuff we used throughout the job. This thing total took about 6 hours to do from start to finish, and that's adjusted for filming time, because when you film, it takes a lot longer. For this job, we used our Western font. We used the 4-inch, the 3-inch, and the 2-inch, and we also used our new stencil, the Tree of Life. I'll leave a link in the description below for everything we used today. And by the way, we don't really have sponsors, guys, so we're funded by selling our products. So we'd appreciate it if you went and checked out makeawoodsign.com and see if there's anything you like. All right, guys, let's make some sawdust.
The first thing we had to do was make our board. Now the sign's going to be 48 inches wide, so we cut our boards at 50 inches. It's always a good idea when you're laminating a board together to make sure you give yourself some wiggle room. It does add an extra step where you have to cut the edges off, but that is well worth it just in case you need that room. Once we had our boards cut at 50 inches, then we use our new flex table saw, which is awesome, by the way, to cut off the rounded edge and give us a nice straight edge for our glue up. Once we had our pieces cut, now we got to glue them together. Now I think, not 100% sure, but I think this will be the last time we use these Rockler clamps. They are just over-engineered. They're too much of a pain. Bar clamps are way easier and way better in our opinion. It's important when you do your glue ups to do a dry fit first. Make sure that all the seams look good, that each board is really where you want it to be, and make sure that you have the best side of the board as the face. Do a dry fit, make sure it's all good to go, and then do your glue up. Trust me on this, it will save you a lot of headache in the future. Once the glue is dry, then we use the disc sander with a 60 grit disc to surface both sides. That way we could choose which one we were 100% for sure going to use on the face. Then I wanted to make my marks at 48 inches to make sure that when I do my layout, I get it exactly where I want it to be. I marked 2 inches up from the bottom of the board and 2 inches down from the top of the board. This is where my bottom line's going to sit and my top line's going to sit. So I drew a line for the bottom set of lettering, and then I marked the bottom of a middle letter for the arched line. That's going to be important here in just a second. Now I wanted to get an idea basically where the top line's going to go and where the stencil's going to go, because I have to do my middle line first because that's the longest line. Everything else is going to be centered off of that. So what I need to do is make sure my longest line can fit between the edge of the board and my stencil. And I want to make sure and even that space up. Once I get that right about where I want it, then I'm going to mark the center of it so I can draw my arch. I'm going to measure on both sides of the arch to make sure that it's right and that the arch isn't going to be kind of cockeyed. Once I get the main one done, then I just extend it a little bit because this line of lettering is kind of long. Now I'm going to set my letters up on my arch to get a rough idea. That way I can get my middle line centered. Remember, everything is going off the longest line, which for this sign is in the middle. An easy way to make sure your Western letters are laid out correctly is that the point in the middle should line up all the way across. It's not exactly in the center, it's up about 1/4 of an inch. So if you're laying out your Western letters, make sure that that point makes a straight line all the way through your letters and you'll be good to go. This is a pretty big stencil, so it's got a little bit of a bowing to it. So we're using this double-sided clear adhesive to make sure it sticks down on the board. and because it's like 2 degrees out here, I used a heat gun just to heat it up a little bit. Notice that I made marks exactly where I want it. That way when I turn it over to spray it, I set it right back where I want it to go. Then I just use my primer and very carefully and very lightly spray my layout. It's always easier with bigger letters and bigger stencils because the pressure from the can doesn't push them around, but you still want to be careful not to overspray. You can see in the tree stencil, some of the lines are a little bit fuzzy, but it's going to be perfectly fine to carve. Now that we have the layout complete, I'm going to trim off the sides to make the sign the exact size we need. I used a straight edge and our flex circular saw, and man, it cut through this redwood like it wasn't even there. The first bit I used is our profile bit at 3/16 of an inch deep. Now, one thing you want to take into account when you're figuring out what depth you want to cut at is the width of the cut. Now, this one has been sharpened several different times, so it actually cuts a little bit wider than a brand new one. So your depth might vary if you're carving this tree, or really when you're carving anything. To do these leaves, they're just like little footballs. I'm feathering in at one end, and then I'm feathering out at the other to make sure I get the sharp points of the leaves. For the branches in the trunk, I'm feathering in at the point, and then I'm following one side of the line all the way down. Now, something to take into account is it's a good idea before you start carving, figuring out which way you want to go. When you're feathering in at the top, your bit takes up the whole width, but as you work your way down, it gets wider. So you don't want to split the difference. You want to pick one side, go down that side, and then come back and feather in from the top and then go down the other side. It's easy to get confused while you're actually carving, so make sure to plan it out ahead of time which way you want to go. The next bit I'm using is our 60-degree bit at 3/16 of an inch deep. Now, one thing you'll notice is that at certain points in these 2-inch letters, I'm lifting up the router base, like right here. I'm doing that so when I get to the fine points at the end of each letter, that it comes to a sharp point. It's not just a rounded little divot. Now, with the bigger letters, you don't really have to worry about that, but with the smaller letters, you really want to make sure you get that as sharp as you can. And you can still get a sharp point with the 60-degree bit. Now, if these were, say, 1-inch letters or 1.5 inches, it would be much, much more difficult. But the bigger the letters, the easier they are to carve. And then for the little bit of wood that's left in the wider areas, I just use the 60-degree to go back in and take those out. And I'm doing that as I'm carving each letter. That way I don't forget and then get the sign all done and have to go back and redo something that I forgot to do. For the larger letters, I'm using the same bit, but I actually dropped it down a little bit deeper. Basically what I'm looking for is I want to drop it down as deep as I can, but not go past the flutes. Now you'll notice that there's still wood left in there, but it's quite a bit more because these letters are bigger. So I'm actually going to come back with a 90-degree and take out all that extra wood. But the same principles apply here. You're just following the inside of the line, and don't think that you have to get it all in one pass. With smaller letters you do because there's a lot less room for error, but these bigger letters you can work your way out to the line and make sure that you get as straight a line as you can. Now I'm going to use that same 60-degree bit, and I'm going to go in and I'm going to take out the middle portion of all the different leaves. Normally I would do something like this with a 90-degree bit, but that's a little bit too wide of a cut for these little spaces, so the 60-degree worked perfect. Now I'm going to switch to the 90-degree bit at 3/16 of an inch deep, and I'm going to go through the sign and I'm going to take out all of the extra wood. That includes the branches and the trunk of the tree, and then also the middle of all of the big letters. I'm just going in small little kind of random circles to give it a good rough texture. The biggest thing on something like this is you want to make sure that your depth is set low enough to where you don't have a bunch of high spots. So kind of think of it like coloring. You're going in there and you're coloring the inside of all the letters with a router bit to make sure that you take it all out, so when you spray it and sand it, you don't have any white spots inside the letters. Because the customer wanted Western letters, I thought the notched corners, kind of the old school Western look of the sign, would look really cool. So I measured 2.5 inches from each corner and made a mark, then I connected those marks with something round. Now I made a huge mistake here. I used this big roll of tape, but that's a little bit too small of a circle, and I found that out after I cut my circles. Now guys, I am far from a master with a jigsaw. I'm not very good. So I cut these things out with a jigsaw, and then me and Dad started looking at it and we're like, man, these things do not look very good. So we had to kind of adjust and figure something else out. And what we figured out, well, what Dad figured out, is the fact that the circle I used was just too small. You can see right there, it's kind of oblong shaped. It just didn't look very good. So we found something that's a little bit bigger. This was about a 5.25 inch circle, and we made marks, and we used, well, Dad used on 2 of them and I used on 2 of them, the belt sander to give it a smooth edge and just slowly sand our way out to those lines, and it made a huge difference. So if you're going to do notches like this, make sure that you use a larger size circle instead of something small. Once my notches were all finally done and complete and looked good, then I used our chamfer bit to give it a fat, deep chamfer around the entire thing. Once all the carving was done, then I used the black primer to spray all my carving and the edges. Now make sure that you guys hit it from different angles. You can see at the bottom of the tree, I actually have some white spots and I can't see it from that angle. Once I came around to the other side of the sign, I was able to see it and fix that. After the primer dried, I used our 60 grit disc on the disc sander to get the majority of the primer off of there. Now you can see that a lot of that sawdust is black. So it's a good idea to blow your sign off in between sanding, because if you don't, it can actually grind some of that back into the board. So once it was all sprayed off, I used my random orbital with a 120 grit disc to give it a smooth finish. For the finish, we use this Czar Poly exterior. This is a water-based finish, so the cleanup on it is super easy. We thinned it out by about 20% and used the critter gun, and the compressor was set right around 50 to 60 pounds. If you guys haven't tried the critter gun yet, man, it is a lifesaver when it comes to spraying your finish. It's a lot cheaper to buy your finish in bulk, whether that's in a quart or a gallon, than it is to buy spray cans. This stuff gives the wood kind of a nice dark look, and it protects really well. We put about 6 coats on here, so in the California weather, there shouldn't be any reason it won't last a couple of years.
So there you go, guys. I love the way this thing came out. It's nice and simple. There's nothing really fancy to it, but man, it really came out just super clean. Hopefully the customer's gonna like it. I think he will. As always, guys, I will leave links in the description below for everything we used today. Thank you so much for watching, and if you have any questions, you can shoot me an email, ryan@makeawoodsign.com. All right, guys, we'll see you on the next one. Bye.